Hey, is this a good volume? Should I turn it up? Is that better? Okay, I see. Okay, all right. It sounds loud to me, but as long as audience likes it, that's the main thing. I have a lot to talk about today, so I'm going to try to be quick. Otherwise, I risk going way over, and I don't want to do that. Something has been really bothering me for many years, and I'm finally getting around to talking about it now. Obviously, we all know what's been happening in Palestine since last October. It's something that bothers us all. Anyone that has an ounce of humanity, it should bother them. But there's something else that's happening that also bothers me. And it is this notion that has been pushed for the last, 30 years. Ever since I was a kid, I remember they started to push this notion that Muslims don't like the Jewish people. And that historically there has been an issue between Muslims and Jews. Like there's this lifelong, millennia-old conflict between the two, right? And that our criticism of Israel is just an extension of this hatred that we have had for the Jewish people for thousands of years. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. Because as you'll see, it's the exact opposite. What is the history of the Muslim and Jewish people for the last 1,500 years? And it's sad that in light of our contribution to the survival and flourishing of the Jewish people and centuries of positive interactions, that some people have tried to push this false narrative that Muslims and Jews have historically not gotten along. I'm going to say some things today that may offend some people, but what I'm saying today is fact, is historical fact. Christian Europe treated Jews very differently than how Muslims treated the Jewish community historically. It's a stereotype that Muslims have always hated the Jewish people. Not only is it false, it's actually the exact opposite. And there's also a stereotype that these Judeo-Christian values, this is a term that you hear a lot, Judeo-Christian values, and that these people have always been connected in a positive sense. You're going to see it's the exact opposite. Some people are trying to flip history around. Muslims have played a vital role in protecting hundreds of thousands of Jewish people, and we need to know our history. And we also need to remember that, yes, while we are critical of Israel, we don't want to distrust or dislike or hate anyone unjustly. Right? And I know it's difficult because of what Israel has done. But we need to separate these two things. The Jewish and Christian people, after all, are Ahl al-Kitab. They are people of the book. But we need to be able to talk about history, and this people did this, and this people did that, without necessarily impacting the way we feel about certain people today. So let's start in 70 AD. So approximately 70 years after Sayyidina Isa returned to Allah. Our Christian brothers and sisters think that he was crucified, that he passed away. We believe that he returned to Allah. So I won't say after his death. 70 years after Sayyidina Isa returned to Allah. The Romans came and they surrounded the city of Jerusalem. They wanted to take Jerusalem. And they surrounded the city and they starved a large number of the inhabitants. And then what did they do? They destroyed all the Jewish temples. And they either killed most of the Jewish population or the Jewish population had to flee. So from 70 years after Sayyidina Isa, ﷺ, there were no Jewish temples in Jerusalem and there were no Jews in Jerusalem. They had to disperse. And so from then until 1948, during the creation of Israel, the Jewish community has either lived under Christian majority land or Muslim majority land. And how were they treated under each? That's what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to compare the two. Obviously, this is just going to be a summary. I can't, go into depth about 1,500 years of history. Christianity, from the beginning, has been intolerant of the Jewish community. Let's just be very blunt about it. They have been intolerant of the Jewish community. Why? Because according to their creed, they killed the Son of God. The Jewish people were responsible for the death of Sayyidina Isa. So they thought that they were Christ killers. That's the term that Christian Europe used to describe the Jewish community, Christ killers. So obviously they hate them. You killed the Son of God. In ancient and medieval Europe, the Jewish community lived as second-class citizens. They were not allowed to own property throughout most of European history, and they were forced to live in designated areas. Now, there is an ancient term for this coined by the Venetians, the people of Venice, Italy. You know what that term is? Ghetto. This term ghetto was coined by the Venetians to describe the Jewish community. Ghetto literally means low class. And that's the term that they use to describe the Jewish community. And now the areas in which that are impoverished nowadays, it's called ghetto, right? Or it's a place has been ghettoized, meaning it's gone down economically. This was a term coined by Christian Europe to describe the Jewish people. They were, in addition, they were prohibited from many noble professions, the Jewish community in Christian Europe. They weren't allowed to be teachers, they weren't allowed to be scholars, many other noble professions, so they had to take whatever they could. They were prohibited from owning land. They were not allowed to ascend politically or economically to a large extent. There was one job, however, that they were allowed to do, and this was a job that the church had prohibited Christians from doing, and that is the lending of money for interest. According to the Vatican, according to Christian theology, if a Christian lends money to another Christian and receives interest in return, they're both damned, and they're both going to hell, and they're going to be excommunicated. They're going to be kicked out of the church. So this was one of the few jobs that the Jewish community was allowed to participate in, and they had no competition, right? Because none of the Christians were doing it, so they excelled. And so they essentially became the first bankers of the world, because they weren't allowed to do anything else, and they excelled at it. And there were many dynasties that were built up, very wealthy dynasties. And they became rich in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries based on lending. Now, eventually, the church saw what was happening, and there was a lot of pressure from the community. We want to make money at this as well. And look at how wealthy and powerful this community is becoming. And they didn't like the Jewish community. Look at how well they're doing from lending. And so the church eventually said, okay, Christians can now lend money to other Christians and receive interest as well. Let's fast forward a bit to the first Crusades, the 11th century, years 1095, 1096. The Christians, European Christians said, we're going to take back Jerusalem from the Muslims. Right? By then it was under Muslim rule. We're going to take it back. And so Christians from England, from France, from Italy started to march towards Jerusalem. But what did they do in Europe? Before they left, they started exterminating the Jewish community in Europe. And now I'm not talking about a small isolated incident. I'm talking Europe-wide. Major cities all across Europe. What was their rationale? If we're going to go back and take Jerusalem, if we're going to go back and take the birthplace of the Son of God, we might as well avenge him and kill the people that killed him along the way. And so you have, this is historical fact. It's not a conspiracy. I'm not making this up. They would find the Jewish communities in Europe, and they would wholesale kill them, men, women, and children. The Jewish community, they would run to their synagogues for protection, and they would burn down the synagogue with people in them alive. And then they started marching towards Jerusalem, and if they found Jews along the way, they would slaughter them along the way. And Muslims, they were protecting themselves. Obviously, they're being attacked, but they were also protecting the Jewish community. And this, where European Christian is attacking and killing the Jewish community, and Muslims are protecting them, this is not the first time you're going to hear me say it, but this is the first one, the Crusades, okay? Now, let's move forward, year 1215. The church put out a decree. This is the Vatican. This is the Vatican normalizing anti-Semitism. They said Jews cannot dress like normal citizens. They had to dress a certain way. They can only live in certain areas, the ghettos, right? And they could only have certain professions. In 1290, just a few years after that, King Edward of England expelled the entire Jewish community from England. For 400 years, there was not a single Jewish individual living in England. For 400 years. Why? Because of anti-Semitism. Shakespeare wrote all of his plays during this time when there wasn't a single Jew in England. He had never interacted with a person from the Jewish community. And yet, Jews are portrayed so horribly in Shakespeare's plays. Like every stereotype you could think of was involved in these plays. Everything that they say about us now, right? They said about the Jewish community back in Christian Europe. It wasn't until 1680 where Jews were actually finally allowed back into England. And that's why the Jewish community in England is relatively small to the rest of Europe. Let's fast forward again. I'm making decent time. Inshallah, we'll finish on time. 1492 in Andalusia, Spain. Now this is when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had taken back Andalusia, Spain, right? Because up until that time it was under Muslim rule, and now they've taken it back. Some of the worst manifestations of anti-Semitism. They took back Granada, and their first decree, within a week or a month of taking back power, their first decree, it's called the Decree of Alhambra because it took place in Alhambra Palace, said that there shall be no Jews living in Andalusia. Within a week, within a month of them taking back control, they said there aren't going to be any Jewish people living in Andalusia. And there were 300,000 to 500,000 Jews living in that area at the time. They were either forced to convert, they were killed, or they were expelled. They had to flee. Those were their options. Many of them went to Muslim majority lands. They went to Northern Africa, Morocco especially, because Morocco is just, right, the Straits of Gibraltar, and you're in Muslim land now. Many of them were in Morocco, all the way to Yemen, right? That's how far they moved Yemen and Iran. This is now the second time where Christian Europe was trying to expel or exterminate the entire Jewish community, and Muslims helped them. They would have had nowhere to go. Had the Muslims said, we don't want you here, they would have all either been exterminated or forced to convert to Christianity. This is historical fact. I mentioned that many of them moved to Morocco. My first mentor, after I graduated and I started working, my first mentor, Allah yarhamu, he passed away many years ago. His name was Gerard. He was born in Casablanca, Morocco, and he was Jewish. His entire family was Jewish. And he would tell me about growing up there, going to the beach, and they had Muslim friends and neighbors and so on and so forth. Let's fast forward again to the 1930s, 1940s. This is the one where I probably need to talk about the least. What happened in the 1930s, 1940s? The Holocaust and Nazi Germany. This is one of the darkest periods in European history. One of the darkest periods in history in general. And I know we are very critical of what Israel has done. But my dear brothers and sisters, Allah says in the Quran, do not let your hatred or distrust of one people get you to mistreat or distrust another. Yes, we're very critical of Israel and its politics and its creation, but that should not cause us to lose our humanity. What happened to the Jewish people during the Holocaust was an absolute tragedy. It was one of the worst crimes committed by humans towards other humans. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge that it happened. But let's be blunt. The Nazis and the Holocaust did not happen in a vacuum. What they did, they were tapping into centuries and centuries and centuries of anti-Semitism, and hatred of the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is European and Christian, 100%. It has nothing to do with Islam, it has nothing to do with Muslims, it has nothing to do with Arabs. This is 100% a European Christian phenomenon, and now they try to project it onto us. And we're not going to let that happen as a community. So this is a summary of what happened to the Jewish community in Christian lands. Let's talk about what happened in Muslim lands. By and large, wherever the Muslims went and there was a Jewish community, the Jewish community flourished. They were given protection and rights in Muslim lands that they were never given in medieval Europe. Never. Now look, I'm not saying life was perfect, right? None of us are naive. I'm not saying life was perfect for them. Life wasn't perfect for Muslims living in Muslim lands. Life isn't perfect now, right? Life is never perfect. I'm not trying to whitewash anything. I'm not trying to overly romanticize our faith or our history. But by and large, our community treated the Jewish community very, very well. When Muslims conquered Iraq and Iran, there were already large Jewish populations there. And they were there because they were expelled from Christian lands. Umar ibn Khattab was the one who eventually took back Jerusalem. When that happened, do you know how many Jews were living in Jerusalem at the time? 0. There were 0. 0. None. There were no synagogues, no Jewish temples in Jerusalem at the time of Umar ibn Khattab. Just a few years after Sayyidina Muhammad's passing, 0. He was the one that invited them back and allowed them to build synagogues. Jews, the Jewish community is there now, starting with Umar ibn Khattab, because they are Ahl Kitab, they are people of the book, under Islamic principles, following the teachings of our Prophet ﷺ. We brought them back. They were kicked out of lands that they never should have been kicked out of, and they were allowed to worship freely. Now, many of those that are critical of Islam will say that Jews were second-class citizens, right, in Jerusalem under Muslim rule. That's not true. Did they have restrictions? Yes. But you cannot compare life 1,500 years ago to secular America now. Secular America, religion plays no role in our daily life. Back then, religion was everything. You were defined first and foremost by your faith. And so it's like, the towers or the minaret or the synagogues couldn't be any taller than the mosques, and right, there were those types of restrictions, but by and large, they lived good lives and they were free to practice their religion. And so if someone is going to compare what life was like for them, don't compare it to secular America now. Compare it to what it was like to any other part of the world for them at that time. Further, in all of Islamic history, the Muslim community never had a policy where we were going to kill all Jews or expel all Jews or force that community to convert. We never had that in our history. But Christian medieval Europe had it on multiple occasions. We never had it. We never had it. Let's talk about in Baghdad under the Abbasids. They had established a Bayt al-Hikmah, which literally means house of wisdom, right? Trying to gather knowledge so that the civilization can advance. Some of the top scholars and some of the top translators of the time were part of the Jewish community. And so they were hired. They were hired and given great jobs and great salaries. And in fact, oftentimes they ran Bayt al-Hikmah, the house of wisdom. That community, the Jewish community at the time, was studying Greek, was studying Latin, and by and large, the Arabs and Muslims were not. So the Jewish community was uniquely qualified. And we said, great, you guys are qualified, mashallah, we're going to put you in charge of it. There were 3 Khalifas at that time. There was the Fatimids in Egypt and the Umayyads in Spain, and they all did something similar. They all established their own Bayt al-Hikmah, their own houses of wisdom, and they also had hired many of the top Jewish and Christian translators and scholars. We did not prevent them from these noble professions. Remember, Europe prevented them from these types of noble, scholarly professions. We did not. In fact, we hired them. They excelled at it, and we paid them well for it. I'll give you an interesting example. In Andalusia, Spain, in roughly the year 1000. The Sultan was a Muslim, obviously, but who was the prime minister? It was a rabbi. This is in Andalusia, Spain, the year 1000. The prime minister was a rabbi. His name was Ismail ibn Nakhrilla. Ismail ibn Nakhrilla. He was a learned man. He rose in the ranks to become the first prime minister of Khutbah, and he was a rabbi. And the people loved and respected him. Obviously, he was made the prime minister. And when the Spanish came to try to take back the Iberian Peninsula, the Iberian Crusades, they call it, right? That lasted about 500 years. But during that time, Ibn Nakhrilla was leading the Muslim army in literal jihad against the Iberian Crusaders. And he was wearing armor, and there's inscriptions of the Quran on this armor, and he was literally leading the Muslims in jihad. And he won those battles, by the way, defending them. Now, there is an unfortunate point. About 20 years later, there was a small massacre of the Jewish population in Cordoba, but you have to know the whole story. So, Ibn Nakhrilla, Ismail ibn Nakhrilla, he eventually passed. And he was buried with honors. He was a man that was loved by the people. His son was appointed as the next vizier. Okay, the Sultan appointed Ismail ibn Nakhrilla's son, Yusuf, to be the next vizier as sort of like a reward. Your father was a good man, an honorable man. We loved him. Out of respect for him, you're going to become the next vizier. The son, Yusuf, was 20 years old at the time, and it turned out that he was a traitor. He sent a letter to one of the nearby kingdoms, and he said, if you guys attack on this day, I'll distract the army. I'll make sure that there's someplace else, right, so you can take back this land. But in exchange, you make me the leader of Cordoba, and I will pay taxes to you, right? And he sent them a letter, and he said, my people will support me in this. Well, that letter was discovered. And they saw this man is trying to launch a coup against his own people, against us. And so what did they do? They literally tore him apart. They went to the palace, they found him, they killed him, and they killed his closest advisors and high-ranking staff. And it said, my people will support me. So people thought that this was a Jewish conspiracy. Mob justice, mob mentality kicked in, and they attacked just sort of random Jews in the Jewish quarter. And it's unfortunate, it's something that we have to acknowledge happened. Many people in the Jewish community were killed because of mob violence. But a few things have to be made clear. One, the Sultan did not order this. No government official ordered this. This was a mob. They got angry, there was a frenzy, and people were killed. And it wasn't because they were Jewish per se. Clearly not, because the prime minister was Jewish. The Jewish community had been living there for many, many years without any issue. This was, we thought you guys were trying to launch a coup, and it was mob justice. I'm not defending it, right? But that's what happened, and that's the entire story. It's an unfortunate part of our history. Let's move on. Within 150 years now, we're still in Cordoba, Spain. One of the greatest Jewish minds was born, raised, and educated in Cordoba. His name is Musa ibn Maymun. Moses Maimonides, the West calls him. You may have heard this name. If you study Jewish history at all, Jewish theology at all, this man is known as one of the greatest, if not the preeminent, Jewish scholar in their history. His honorific title, right, the Jewish community referred to him as Rambam. Right, I like that name, Rambam. But it's Musa ibn Maymun, Moses Maimonides, Rambam, it's all the same person. He's one of the most respected theologians in the history of Judaism. He traveled the Muslim world. He was eventually buried in Cairo. He spoke fluent Arabic. He went through the madrasa system in Cordoba. So he learned about Islam along with learning about the sciences and all of that. He excelled in his studies. And his biographers stated that he had parts of the Quran memorized, he could read Arabic fluently, he knew about fiqh and aqidah and all of that. He was a rabbi, right? Now he took these concepts and he Judaicized them, right? And he made them mainstream for many of the Jewish people, right? And this is not a conspiracy, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what scholars do, that's what scientists do. You take knowledge and you build upon it, right? And that's what he did, so that's not a bad thing. And in fact, in the Stanford Encyclopedia, there's an article called The Islamic Influence on Moses Maimonides, right? So this isn't just us saying it. And he offers proofs for the existence of God, the concepts of God, prophethood, theology, things of that nature. Why is this significant? Generally speaking, up to that point, Judaism had focused on law. There was a big focus in Jewish theology up to that point on law. How do you act? How do you behave? What are the do's and don'ts? Rambam was the first person, or one of the first rabbis to come along and talk about aqidah, your fundamental belief about God, the afterlife, the day of judgment, things of that nature. And it was heavily influenced by his madrasa training. In fact, he wrote several books about it, and he wrote a creed, a 13-point creed that till this day, many observant Jews recite. It's one of the first things that they recite when they wake up. It's almost identical to Islamic aqidah. So I believe there is one God, he has no partners, he cannot be described. I believe in the resurrection, the coming of the Messiah, and so on and so forth. This is coming from a rabbi, Rambam, who was heavily influenced by Islamic scholarship and Islamic thought. He also became, now listen to this. This is maybe the most amazing point of his life. He became one of the best physicians of the time. He became, in fact, the preeminent physician of the time. He studied the works of Ibn Sina, right? Avicenna, as the West calls him, but he was a well-known Muslim physician and scholar. And who did Rambam, Moses Maimonides, who did he become the personal doctor to? Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Saladin, the man who took back Jerusalem, right? After the Romans had, or after the Christians had taken it in the Crusades. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. Rambam was his personal physician because he was the best doctor of the time. This is how we treated the Jewish community. We gave them rights, we allowed them to practice their religion freely. If they were great, they could excel. And you can become the best physician in the land. Nobody can accuse our community of anti-Semitism. Nobody can accuse our community of anti-Semitism. The last 2,000 years, never has the Jewish community flourished as it flourished in Khutbah and in Baghdad. The largest synagogues till this day are still there, built during Muslim rule, not during Christian rule. Remember in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, every Jew must either leave, convert, or die? Well, they went, where did they go? Sultan Muhammad II, at that time, he was the Sultan during that time, he gave a decree. He said, anyone who flees from Andalusia shall be welcome in Muslim lands. He also said, anyone who prevents the Jewish community from settling in Muslim lands will be punished by the Sultan himself. And they went all over, from Morocco to Iran. And they stayed there until 1947, by the way. 1947, large Jewish community throughout Arab and Muslim lands. Now, let's discuss another chapter, 1947. The Holocaust, World War II. They were literally being exterminated by Nazi Germany. A few examples that I really want you to know. North Africa, very common. You'll find stories. So you know, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, they were colonized by France. So they were under like Muslim rule, but the Ottoman Empire was on its last leg, okay? The Nazis took over France. And so the Nazis took over France, and France was occupying Northern Africa. The Nazis then ordered Northern Africans, the Muslim community, hand over your Jewish community. Very common. You'll find Muslim families that take in the Jewish families, And they say, just in case, we'll hold your valuables until all this passes and we'll return it to you. Sultan Muhammad refused to obey, and he gave an order to all Muslims, do not follow this command that's coming out of France, threatening our own lives in the process. When Christian Europe was trying to exterminate them, the Muslims were protecting them. Now, this is the third instance. Remember, the first was the Crusades. The second was when they took back the Spanish Inquisition. And now the third is World War II. Christian Europe trying to exterminate the Jewish community and Muslims protecting them. Albania, the country of Albania during the Holocaust. It's the only country in Europe that has a Muslim majority. Did you know that? Albania is the only one. The Jewish population in every European country went down. One, because they were being exterminated, but two, they were fleeing. There was only one country in Europe during that time that saw its Jewish population increase. You know which one? Albania. It's no coincidence that it's also the only Muslim majority country. The Nazis and fascists knew that many of them were going to Albania, and they started bombing Albania. And they said to the Muslims, hand over the Jewish community and we'll pay you. They wanted to bribe them. How many of the Jewish community were turned over by the Albanians? Zero, not a single one. It was an open secret. They would bring them in, they would like a Muslim family would take in a Jewish family, put them in Albanian clothing, and the fascists and Nazis couldn't tell the difference. Right? They didn't know who was who. We all looked the same to them. Right? It was an open secret that we were hiding Jewish families. In fact, the Prime Minister of Albania at the time, Mehdi Fresher, he gave a secret order during Nazi occupation. He said, I quote, all Jewish children will sleep with your children and we will eat the same food and we will all live as one family. This is our history as a Muslim community. We cannot be accused of anti-Semitism, and they're trying to make it seem now as if we have always hated this community. Nothing could be further from the truth. You have to know your history. In France, remember I said that Nazis took over France. The Imam Abdul Qadir of the Grand Mosque of Paris, one of the largest masajid in Europe, he said, bring me the Jewish families and we'll hide them in our basement. They saved thousands of the Jewish community. They forged Islamic documents, right, so that it would look like they were actually Muslims. And he said, just dress like a Muslim. Nazis couldn't tell the difference. They helped save thousands and thousands of them. These are the Islamic principles. Bravery and honor, with a corrupt ruler. It's sad that we have forgotten this history. And not only have we forgotten it, they're trying to flip it around. Like, if you don't know history, that's one thing. When you're trying to reverse it, flip it around, that's something else entirely. Running out of time here. Supplicate to Allah to forgive your sins. My dear brothers and sisters, I want you to be aware that, I'm not mentioning this to remind the Jewish community of a debt that they owe us. That's not why we're doing this. We're not doing this to brag. We're not doing this for any sort of compensation. We're doing it, one, to set the record straight, especially the youngsters who may not know this history. Or if you're a bit older, you don't know. We're setting the record straight about our history. We are not going to let anybody rewrite our history for us, especially when we were the good guys and they try to make us out to be the bad guys. And the bad guys, they're trying to make them out to be the good guys. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. We don't want any thanks. We're not looking for any sort of reward or compensation. And we take comfort in knowing that Allah sees all and knows all and will ultimately bring justice to all people. My dear brothers and sisters, be proud of your history. Be proud of your history. Know who you are. Know what you have done. Know what you have accomplished in life. You and your parents and your great-grandparents and your ancestors. We have a great history. Do not allow anyone to make you or your kids to be embarrassed to be Muslims. May Allah give us strength, inshallah. اللهم اغفر للمسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات الأحياء منهم والأموات إنك السميع مجيب الدعوات. Oh Allah, forgive the Muslim men and women. Forgive the devout men and women, those who are alive and those who have passed. You are indeed the one who listens and answers all supplications. Welcome, Salah.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Hayya ala salat, hayya ala falah. Come to salat, come to salat. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah.
Remember, when you are at your lowest, making sujood, making dua to Allah the highest, that is a good time to make dua. Allah. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. مرج البحرين يلتقيان بينهما برزخ لا يبغيان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان يخرج منهما اللؤلؤ والمرجان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان وله الجوار المنشآت في البحر كالأعلام فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان كل من عليها فان ويبقى وجه ربك ذو الجلال والإكرام فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان يسأله من في السماوات والأرض كل يوم هو في شأن فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان سنفرغ لكم أيها الثقلان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان الله أكبر سمع الله من حمده الله أكبر الله الله أكبر الله أكبر الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين يا معشر الجن والإنس إن استطعتم أن تنفذوا من أقطار السماوات والأرض فانفذوا لا تنفذون إلا بسلطان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان يرسل عليكما شواظ من نار ونحاس فلا تنتصران فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان فإذا انشقت السماء فكانت وردة كالدهان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان الله أكبر سمع الله من حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Dear brothers and sisters, I have to apologize once again for going over. Inshallah, you found the khutbah beneficial. Maybe one day, inshallah, I'll finish on time. Maybe not, Allahu alam at this point. But just one last thing I wanted to say. I wanted to finish, because I know that some people have to go. That goodwill between the Muslim community and the Jewish community remained until 1948 during the creation of Israel. Many of the Jewish community living in Muslim and Arab lands moved to Israel at that point. They were promised land, they were promised assistance. From their perspective, many of them believe in Zionism. They think that it's their land, and so many of them went. But at that point, the backlash and the negative sentiments that began to develop against the Jewish community from the Muslim community was because of the creation and the politics of Israel. It's not because they were Jewish per se. It's because what Israel had done, expelling Palestinian Muslims and Christians. Many Palestinians were killed in the process. The land was taken. That was an absolute crime against humanity. And that is when some of the negative sentiments began. But it wasn't because they were Jewish. It was because of what they had done to the people of Palestine and the people of Al-Sham. So know your history, and do not let anyone make you feel less than or make you feel as if our faith is somehow deficient or that we have a hatred of certain people. So we need to know our history, inshallah. Be proud of who you are, be proud of where you come from.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. I do have a couple of announcements.